Today I want to go through, as the title suggests, and discuss wind to you and understanding wind and shooting with wind, primarily in ELR, which is extreme long range shooting and ultra long range shooting, but also it really comes right back to shooting even in all ranges and like I said, understanding wind and how to read it. So first of all, I suppose the real logic or the real thing I want to go through is the understanding of it and what is it? What are we actually talking about? What we're actually talking about is air flow, and that causes air pressures. So when you have a low pressure area of wind in our atmosphere, of air in our atmosphere, and you have a high pressure area, the wind travels from one to the other. Or the air travels from one to the other. That's what wind is. So that happens in our larger environment with temperatures of our oceans and the environment, whether that's vegetation or it's man-made structures causing different heat things and that sort of stuff in the lower world. We have high speed, high range winds which are going around the planet, all westerlies and all heading off around the planet. We have, what I'm going on about there is we have in our higher atmosphere, we have high speed winds, and then we have layers actually of wind that come back down to our ground winds, which are largely fairly tame in comparison to our high winds. And especially in our extreme long range shooting, we start touching into some mid-level winds. So they're higher winds than what we can see, but up as the bullet goes higher in the air, they get affected. Okay, so that's the nature of what wind's happening, and as said, environmental conditions really affect things. So in the first level of things, when you are talking about reading wind and ranging wind, there's the normal spoken about, understood things that you should be doing. You look at your conditions, you look at what you can feel in your wind, you can hear in your wind, you can see what the trees are doing, whether the leaves are flapping around or flags or washing on the line or whatever, you can see that sort of stuff and you can see that side of things. There's working out direction, whether you're experienced enough to be able to feel it and see it, or just grabbing a piece of grass or a piece of something or other and dropping it and seeing where it goes. That gives you an idea of where the wind is where you're standing. Or in our high-tech world, you can have a wind meter and stick it up in the air, put it up as high as you can reach. Having it down next to yourself and reading wind is not going to tell you the wind. You need to get the obstacle of you out of the road. So put it up, find the direction and do that side of things. So those are all good basics, but only relevant as long as you're factoring in the environment you're in. So there is, as said, it's all about air pressures. So if you have a flow of air traveling across and there's an obstacle, you're going to have higher pressure on one side of it. That causes the wind to spread out around and go around the sides of that obstacle. So around the sides of that obstacle, you'll tend to have higher speed of wind as that high pressure is built up where the wind's been coming across, and then the air rushes down here. And on the lee side, on the other side, you're going to have a low pressure and you're also going to have less wind. If you're standing in reference to this thing in any place around this obstacle, whether that's a building, that's a hill, that's a tree, whatever it is, if you're in reference to this, you have to understand that what you're feeling or what you're measuring is going to be affected by those things. We have a particular place we shoot on a hill, which we shoot, and you see a lot of our videos, where the wind is always very high there. There is a reason for that. And I shouldn't say always, it normally is. It normally is higher than what the wind is at the normal ground area. And that is because how should I explain this? It's on a little bit of a hill after a big hill. The wind is largely coming from east to west, is the normal sort of direction of the wind we're normally shooting with. And this large hill is enough to get to the point where it's getting into the mid-range wind, so you're slightly higher than ground speed wind, is getting the road of that. So that forces the air up and over it, forces it up to start off with. So if you live in our area, you'll find that there's lots of hang gliders and parasailers and things that like to jump off this hill because that wind's pushing them up, so they like to fly around over here. But that wind pushes up over the hill, And that same thing causes those mid-range winds to come down lower than they normally would for a little while, which is right onto the little knoll that we shoot on. So we tend to have higher speed winds because of the nature of that higher speed wind, or that mid-range in the way of mid-height wind being pulled down a little bit after coming over that hill, and that rushes across the top of that knoll we're on. But that can obviously affect in any situation. Just through normal ground winds, when it's going around a hill, there's going to be higher speed winds as it's starting to push around that. More a case of where you've got buildings or multiple buildings, and you'll tend to have a gap between, and you'll find the wind's generally going to go a little bit faster between the buildings rather than it did if there was no wind whatsoever, if no buildings whatsoever. And when you're shooting around bunches of trees, we've certainly seen the situation which can be very hard to read. You can have your target set up against something, which is another instance I'd talk about. You have a gang of trees, in our sort of area shooting, there's lots of paddocks and things that then will be alongside strips of bush and stuff like that. And if the wind's coming the right angle, you can get to a point where the target seems to be, if you look at your wind flag, and depending on what you're in, you can see very little wind. But what you're actually looking at is the lee of the trees. So the wind's actually pushing up against this tree bank, and the trees are stopping the wind from blowing. So where your target is, you're not seeing any wind on your flag. So there's two things that'll happen in that sort of situation. One is your mid-range stuff where you haven't got anything to see is probably where your wind is. The other thing is when you have a direct line like that, you can actually find that as the wind changes, or you'll find some blustery conditions where it actually just pushes around the side occasionally. Occasionally you'll see the flag blow. And that's because you actually have this interruption in the wind. And I suppose another thing I'd explain on that score, and all parts of what I'm trying to explain there, is that wind is a very, an extremely irregular thing actually. We think about it, I think most people think about it as a nice, smooth, constant flow, and occasionally you'll see gusty sort of wind, but that's a particular thing, so it's gusty wind. But the truth of it is, wind, if you've ever looked at swirls of mixing paint together, or running a bath, or looking at the water flowing down a stream, that sort of stuff, and you look at all those patterns and wriggles and shapes and stuff that you see in that side of things, well, wind is at least that violent, or that rough, and with wobbles and wriggles and all sorts of shapes. If you watch smoke come off a fire and see all the different patterns and shapes and wriggles it goes through, well, wind does that all the time. That's what wind is. So what I'm trying to say with that is that that's very hard to explain all the details of what you're going to see, because the conditions out there are so varied. The best thing you can do is make sense of where the wind's coming and where you're likely to see inconsistencies. If you're on a flat plane and you can feel your wind, and you've got a flat plane for 1,000 square acres or miles, so just huge big flat area, then the wind's going to settle down and diffuse and be a very constant wind. So then you can actually read your wind and go, okay, that's what it is, and then everything's going to work. But the moment you have an obstacle, a hill, a valley, any of those sorts of things where the wind is potentially going to be doing different things in between it, then you are going to, two things, find it harder to read and need more of educated guessing to get to where you're shooting, and then see what your consistency in the wind is with your shots. Or well, like I said, once you start to learn that these bits and pieces can cause issues, then it will start to make more sense of, whether that's a good place to set up your target. If you're having to take the shot, you understand where you can try and improve your odds or not. But it is definitely a case of the fact that your terrain is a major contributor to what your wind's going to be doing. And I suppose one of the things that inspired me to talk about wind was there's a few things that have been said, which are, I suppose, inaccurate or misguided at best. One, and I suppose the first one to go with, is talking about people saying, why don't you have flags halfway out through your range? When you're shooting extreme long range, why don't you have multiple flags out there? Well, to start off with, and the fundamental reason you wouldn't do that is that your bullet doesn't travel along the ground, it doesn't travel along line of sight. When you're shooting out to extreme distance, your bullet is traveling at height and coming back down. Now, over your shot, it's not massive height, but when you're talking in the thousands of meters, then you are starting to talk about or yards, then you're starting to talk about coming up to hundreds of feet. So you're moving up into the air where there is different wind than what you are shooting in. And what you're standing in and what your target's standing in. So your wind flag and where you are not reading the same wind that you're shooting in. So flags would be a complete waste of time, because they're at best going to give you a very limited reading. In most cases, their reading is completely irrelevant. The wind is just as likely going a different direction once you've gone more than 100 feet in the air. The way to answer that sort of stuff and the way, well, how do you do it? How do you make it possible? Well, you do the things as what I always do is I start to read what the conditions are. You can see what's actually happening in your trees and your dust and your dirt and you've got your environment, so you've got valleys and bits and pieces or gangs of trees or like I said about the hill, all that sort of stuff. You know those things are going on, so you get an idea of what your wind could potentially be doing. You've got your clouds, and you can see which way your clouds are doing. For me, probably the most important thing that I do is the weather report. So the weather report and understanding what's going on that side of things is very relevant for understanding what those higher winds are going to be doing. And in truth, in extreme long range, you really have to go on an expedition. You have to explore, you have to discover with your first shot. And sometimes everything's lied to you. Sometimes it'll be this, and this, and this, and this, and it should be that, and the damn shot will be 20 meters over to the side because that's not what the wind's doing. And in some cases, in irregular conditions, you really do not only have to walk the round onto target, you also have to pay attention to the shots. You'll see quite commonly that I'll shoot one and it'll be off target, all of a sudden something's changed. And I'll have that could have been me, I could have messed up. And that could be that the conditions have changed. So I'll tend to do exactly the same shot again and see what actually happened. And sometimes there'll be 3 shots in a row where I've actually missed in verifying that that's wrong before I correct and go back on there, because I know the wind's changed. And that does happen. Another feature that is in the extreme long range shooting thing as well is that wind at 6 o'clock and at 12 o'clock, so going with you and coming against you, does affect the shot dramatically. Now, people who are used to shooting at even up to 1,000 yards, it starts to affect you there, but certainly at the 300 yards and 400 yards and 600 yards with high power rifles, so centerfires in high powers, whether it's a 6.5 Creef or a 223 or whatever it is, but a bullet's going quickly, it doesn't make much difference. You're not seeing much difference, because whether the shot has to travel another meter or less, or a meter less, it's only going to change things by an inch or so in elevation. Out in extreme long range, and whether that's 1,500 yards or that's 2,000 yards or that's 3,000 yards, the further out you go, the further that the bullet is coming down more. Also, the bullet is more in the air for a lot longer time, which will move into my next point. But because of that, means that it's had more stuff fighting it, so it's going to have dropped down further, because the forward and back, and that's if the wind's pushing it. If the wind's, pushing against it. If the wind's with it, then it's going to make it go have less drop. So it does affect things a lot, and that's probably the most common change I'll see. All of a sudden the thing's shooting 2 MOA low, a couple of shots, now I'll lift it back up, the wind's changed. It does affect dramatically, for an obvious reason. The main friction the bullet's fighting is wind. If that wind is all moving at 5 miles an hour more against it, well, there's more friction on that bullet, it has to slow down more, as simple as that. And that's, as I said, the other thing is time in the air. Another comment that I've heard said, which flabbergasts me a little bit to be truthful, but I've heard it recently a couple of times, is that the the wind for your first third of your shot is the most important wind. That's going to affect your shot the most. Okay, well, like I said, flabbergasting. Let me explain why that flabbergasts me. As I started this video, talking about what wind is actually air pressure and moving of air, creating different air pressures. So when you have a bullet traveling through the air, you have wind blowing to the side of it. That flow ends up with high pressure on this side. The air scoots around at low pressure on this side. That simple thing causes things to move away from the high pressure towards the low pressure. We can get complicated about obviously the density, the actual weight versus area of the bullet. It means that if it's a feather, it blows really fast, and if it's a lead ball, it hardly blows at all. But in saying that, bullets are all roughly the same weight and density and that sort of stuff, as much as they're big differences in our world, whether it's monolithic or lead core or got tungsten or whatever type thing. All those things are big differences to us. In actual fact, in reality, a bullet compared to a feather, all bullets are about the same sort of thing. So we have this thing pushing against it. The main thing that is this movement, this wind against here, let's forget about the fact that wind is a variable thing. Let's go with this being a constant force. The only other force that's on that bullet, the only other thing that applies to that bullet is that force is by time. So the longer the bullet is under this same force, the further it's going to move. So that simple equation turns into the faster a bullet gets from A to B, the less movement it's going to have. The slower a bullet gets from A to B, with the same constant force on it, the more it's going to move. So, very simply, when the bullet is doing 3,000 feet per second, even though that force is constant on the side of it, it's not going to move anywhere near as much, because at 3,000 feet per second, it's traveling very quickly through the air. So over that same 100 meters or 200 meters, it's going to only move a little bit in comparison to when it's come back down to where it's doing 1,500 or 1,000 feet per second. In that same thing, the bullet is going to be pushed at least 3 times as much. So the wind at the end of your shot has a lot more influence over the bullet than the wind at the beginning of your shot, simply through the nature of the fact the bullet's going quick at the beginning and it's going slow at the end. It spends a short time traveling the first distance, it spends a long time traveling the end distance. So that's the simple bit. And I'm really not sure where that comment comes from, the first third of the bullet is where it's most effective. Maybe it came from the world of people saying, listen, you can only read these conditions here properly, so factor this stuff in most importantly, and it's probably going to be right down the end as well. I don't know. Like I said, simple, don't need to get complicated at all. If it's moving quickly, the wind has less influence. If it's moving slow, the wind has more influence. All relevant, obviously, just very hard to read the wind at long ranges. And the truth of the reading the wind side of things is that the absolute best thing to tell you what the wind's doing is the dust that comes off the ground just after you've missed the target. So yes, not ideal for your first shot hits, but in my honest way of looking at it, in all practical ways of looking at it, once you're going into extreme long range, the best, except for being lucky, the best you can actually do is get on there in 2 shots, probably maybe 3, in constant wind conditions. And yes, that's the reality of extreme long range shooting. So I suppose there's another bit that I'd go into and make sense of things a little bit, and all the stuff I'm actually talking about, and another driver for the reason I'm talking about wind and what you're doing with it, is the likes of our ballistic calculators, our solution solvers, our how to get our firing solution, the different ways that we create that, whether that's through a table or that's through a proper applied ballistic unit. I shouldn't say applied ballistics, I'm not trying to pick on anyone in particular. It's an app on your phone, it's whatever it is, no matter whatever system you're talking about, it is the nature of, in a lot of cases, using smart algorithms. Algorithm is just a mathematical way to apply a table or to apply already recorded data to try and predict an outcome. Now, that, I suppose, how can I explain this in various ways? It means it's a very good thing to help you, but it is trying to predict the future. And as of all computer models, of all algorithms, of all that sort of stuff, they're actually using data that's already happened. The more you can feed into that data, the more likely it is to be correct, but it can only go to a certain point, and especially with the likes of reading wind and that sort of stuff. Very good ways to learn things and very good to set up and understand it, but never consider that it is going to be perfect all the time because of what it's trying to do. It's trying to predict what's going to happen. And that's everyone, especially when you're talking wind and especially talking extreme long range. If you're taking a shot that takes more than 1 second, let alone going into 5 seconds or 10 seconds or 15 seconds, that is in the future. So the wind will change. A gust, whether a slight change in the wind, a large change in the wind. I was talking about how lumpy and bumpy the shapes of smoke looks and that side of things. Well, that's what wind's doing too. When you're walking into gusty wind, it's not a puff, puff, puff thing that's actually happening. If you can imagine, that wind current is shaped probably like a set of waves. And those waves are what are pushing against you as they go past. That's what gusting wind is. Not trying to complicate it too much in the conversation. What I'm trying to say, to try and predict things, no matter how advanced, an algorithm, a chart, a computer model can't really see into the future. They're only using what they suspect out of data previously recorded is going to happen rather than actually doing any real predictions. Okay, another piece I want to touch on there is the new systems that we're getting in the way of wind reading. Very nice systems in the way of reading things. I'm sure they'll end up with Bluetooth hookups to target and all that sort of stuff, so you can get wind readings all over the place. And yes, these things can help. There's the Doppler radar that they've got, that it's coming out shortly. Sounds a bit pricey for everyone at the moment, but to try and read things, they're talking up to 500 meters at this moment. I'm sure they'll go further with that sort of stuff. Listen, these are all great things. And you're combining that with shooting apps to try and get this job done, get it done perfectly. Listen, I get it. It sounds marvelous, and I think it will be very helpful in some places. But I would like to factor back in that the main detail, the main thing that makes a good shooter, and especially at longer ranges and long range and extreme range and beyond, there is a level of intuition that needs to be involved in this equation. Yes, I use the word intuition. Not trying to be airy-fairy. I'm trying to point out the fact that we're looking into the future and we're trying to predict what's going to happen. So reading all this sort of stuff, whether you're trying to do it electronically or you're really, in my way of doing that sort of shot, is you're looking at the conditions, you're paying attention to the details, but you're doing more than just what is immediate, because as said, you're looking into the future. So you're trying to work out what the rhythms are. You're trying to work out what you can see is going to be happening. You're trying to work out those bits and pieces. Even if it's the first shot and you're trying to shoot extreme long range and you're trying to get it done straight away, then the only advice I can give to really try and make that happen is you're going to spend a lot more time looking before you start rubbing against that trigger. Before you rack that bolt, you want to make sure that you've started to understand what you can see. And there is always a lot more out there to look at, to see, than you think until you actually start looking, until you actually start paying attention to it. Understand in your terrain where you'd expect the wind that you think is there, how that's going to affect things. That'll tend to give you a clue of where you should be looking. Ultimately, it can come down to that first shot exploration out there, and that's what it is. But listen, your intuition, paying attention to details, using, not relying, using the tech you got in front of you, very valuable. But it comes down to the shooter and what he does, and shooter, spotter, that sort of stuff, that team, those the humans in the equation are still, to me, the most important part of this equation, and learning from the details, recording your data, all that sort of, all normal bits and pieces, but you're out there paying attention to those things, paying attention to what you can discover by looking is the most valuable bit of reading the wind. Anyway, guys, hope that makes some sense. Thank Thanks for checking in on us. We'll catch you next time.
Hi everybody, Sam here. If you like the video and you like what we do, it'd be great to get some support. There's a few ways to do that. Over here, there's a link to a web store which not only has our products, but it has support bits. The money from that goes directly to our channel. And we have our coffee cups. These are $30, they cost us $10. So that's $20 that will go directly into helping us bring these videos to you. Every bit of support is greatly appreciated. Thanks everybody, bye for now.